Welcome to the Diet Doctor Podcast with Dr. Brett Scher. Today I'm joined by Dr. Gary Fetke, an orthopedic surgeon in Tasmania, Australia, but also, more importantly, a man who has suffered for years under investigation and accusation for teaching people about nutrition, teaching his patients about nutrition. He was basically persecuted because he was trying to help people by advising them how to eat. And he was effectively silenced for years, but now has been exonerated, and it has fueled him just to teach people more about not only his struggles and what he went through, but it's helped him uncover a lot of the influences behind what we're told or how we're told to eat. And the influences run deep with industry and religion, and it's really surprising. Sometimes it reads like a suspense novel or a fiction movie to really keep you on the edge of your seat and with conspiracy theories. But as he and his wife Belinda have shown and talked about many times, it's there. It's in writing. It's in documents that they've uncovered. And it's a little scary, but at the same time, the message is that we have to open our eyes. We have to be aware of outside influence, and we have to question the status quo. And that's how we move forward, and that's how we learn. As part of his work, he's written a book, Inversion, One Man's Answer for World Peace and Global Health. So as you can see by that title, quite ambitious, but he's well on his way to helping us understand this and giving us the path of how we need to see things a little bit differently and understand the influence put upon us. So hopefully this will be a very eye-opening and enjoyable interview with Dr. Gary Fetke. Dr. Gary Fetke, thank you so much for joining me today on the Diet Doctor Podcast.
Delight, Brett.
Well, it's been a pleasure to meet you. I can't believe with all the circles we run in that it's just the first time I've gotten to meet you. And it is like meeting a celebrity, which I'm sure if you would have looked back, 3-4 years ago to think you'd be in this position would probably be pretty crazy, wouldn't it?
I'm just a normal guy. I didn't ever mean to become a celebrity. And that doesn't sit well on my shoulders. Even though when I come along to these meetings, people want to catch up and chat.
Yeah.
What I've just been doing is what I had to do, just do the right thing, and I'm fairly stubborn, which has been proven over time.
Right. Which is so amazing. You wonder, like, why was it you that this happened to? Why was it you who saw that as an orthopedic surgeon, you weren't helping patients in the way that you could? Why was it you who started talking about nutrition with your patients and then got basically silenced and muted by the societies? But because it was you, because you're stubborn enough, because you're a fighter, because you believe so passionately, you were the one who was able to push through and come out the other side, showing that you were right. So what is it about you that made you survive this process?
I think the first thing is that I recognised the issues of sugar and carbohydrate loading, particularly in diabetics, relatively early. So
Yeah.
if you came out now as a doctor and said, I'm criticising the amount of sugar in a patient's load in the hospitals, you wouldn't be in nearly as much trouble.
Right.
So first of all, I recognised it early, and then I started talking about it. Then I got involved in social media, and that's when I got into trouble because I was starting to become a voice. And the other thing is that my message was, let's reduce sugar for patients, particularly in diabetics. I questioned hospital food, but the most important thing was that I wasn't selling anything.
Right.
I didn't have a book. I didn't have a business that was dependent on it. We did start, a dietetic service down the track, but that was because no one else was giving that, that support to people that was required. So because I didn't have anything, and I was actually at the coalface and literally looking at the end complications of diabetes and obesity and lifestyle disease, whether or not it's arthritis or, as it was evolving in my practice, a significant amount of diabetic foot surgery.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty hard to argue against me if I'm actually the surgeon doing the amputations, and I'm actually seeing the end product,
Right.
and making a noise about it. So that, as it turns out, the cereal industry, the Dietitians Association of Australia, I think found me as a threat because A, I actually had an answer for the problem, but B, it was actually counteracting or completely the opposite of what they were promoting.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a second. As an orthopedic surgeon, one of your big money makers. One of the big things that you do on a regular basis is joint replacements in people who are overweight and obese, and that's what has contributed to a lot of their joint disease. You amputate toes and feet for people who have diabetes and non-healing ulcers. That's what a big part of what orthopedic surgeons do. So why were you the one to say, well, wait a second, there's a better way to do this, to prevent all this, to prevent people from getting here? What did you see differently?
Well, like a lot of doctors who have embarked on the low carb pathway, you do it for yourself first of all.
Yeah.
So I'm 20 odd kilos lighter now than I used to be. I was pre-diabetic. I had a run-in with a malignant pituitary tumor 20 odd years ago. I had psoriasis. I had sort of inflammatory joint disease. So, I ran my own pathway to my own health.
Right.
And so adopting low carb, as it turns out, LCHF now, but it started with the whole sugar issue first of all. So I had the benefits for myself, and then I started saying, well, hang on, what if it works for me? It's going to start working for my patients. In between times, I experimented on the family and on my theatre team. So I didn't go straight to my patients.
Right.
And then we had and it just it was so obvious that this is what we had to do. Again, I started speaking out about it. I come from a background of actually being proactive on patients taking care of themselves, first of all. So if you go back 25 years, I wouldn't operate on smokers.
Yeah.
I said, look, and I used to give a paper where there's smoke, there's fire. And so if you looked at the early science of that, it was smoking has, deleterious effects on, our cardiovascular tree, our healing potential. And, it's now completely mainstream that we should be avoiding major surgery on people who are smoking. So the next thing from that was that I started avoiding doing surgery, in fact, refusing to do major joint replacements on patients that were too fat. That's a politically incorrect term to use now, but that was the scenario. So I drew a line in the sand at patients with a BMI of more than 35, and and then the literature's there, well and truly, that supports that stand.
Because of higher complication rates and...
Well, first of all, if they actually reduce their weight, they don't need the surgery.
Right.
If they do come to surgery, they have higher complications rates, there's higher rates. And that's not just anaesthetic, that's theatre time, that's wound issues, it's malalignment issues with joint replacements, and longevity. So they don't tend to last as long.
But were your colleagues down the street just perfectly happy to operate on those people that you turned away?
Well, I won't use the word perfect, but they were happily continuing on that pathway. And so I've had patients that wouldn't adopt what I was recommending and go to my colleagues down the road. And I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
But if you don't offer them the option and the choice to avoid that surgery, and the same thing with bariatric surgery nowadays, we have good options. And when I hear bariatric surgeons saying, oh, they tried dieting, I said, have they actually tried LCHF? And they go, oh, no, that doesn't work. And I said, well, actually it does.
Yeah, isn't that when people say they've tried everything and failed, and I'm sure that's what they say to you when they come, I've tried dieting and it doesn't work. And you say, well, let's explore this a little bit more. So what have you seen? I mean, I'm sure you've seen some impressive changes in people who've adopted LCHF.
One of the fascinating things in orthopedics is that people actually, a lot, not everyone, they lose their arthritis pain before they lose weight.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
I've had patients, have dramatic improvements in their joint arthritic pain within 10 to 14 days.
Really?
I can remember a fellow, he said, like, I've come to you because I know I'm overweight and I've got arthritis and I need a joint replacement. I said, well, and he said, I've come to you because I know you're not going to operate on me straight away and you're going to tell me to diet. I just need help. So look, he went along, he went and saw a dietitian that was completely on board with it, and then rang up 10 days later and said, look, I've lost all my arthritis pain. He lost it all.
In 10 days?
In 10 days.
Wow, that's remarkable.
And so if you actually throw that concept out there, then there's 1,000 N=1 stories of people losing their pain or disproportionately losing their pain before weight loss. The weight loss comes along and that's got its added benefits, both short and long term. But I'm still doing joint replacement on patients that have done LCHF.
Yeah.
But they're coming back to me a year down the track or 2 years down the track. They hobble in and they get better quicker.
Yeah.
They've gone into training. I often say, look, you're in training for a joint replacement. Do this try that, get your fitness up, do a bit of exercise.
Right, and I think that's a good point because sometimes we have to be careful about overstating the benefits we can get. It's not like it's a cure-all and is going to reverse all arthritis, but it can certainly delay it. It can certainly improve recovery. It can certainly improve function leading into and after a joint replacement. I mean, those seem like fairly reasonable conclusions that you can draw. But when the literature doesn't exist, right? The 10,000 person study about half getting LCHF, half getting joint replacements, when that doesn't exist yet, but the clinical N of ones exist, you find it hard to convince other surgeons about what you're seeing, and like once you see it, you can't unsee it. So why doesn't everybody see it, right?
Well, that's part of one of my talks coming up, is as to why, as a medical community, we're not seeing it, and that's complex in itself. So what you can do is actually let patients set the example. They go back to their general practitioners. In the orthopedic meetings, you keep standing up and saying the same thing. And now I'm asked to speak about the topic. At an orthopedic meeting, and surgical meetings coming up, I get a voice now. So there's an interest there in surgeons, and we had a chat, beforehand about some years ago. I gave a talk on don't operate on obese patients, and I nearly got, and I gave 200 papers, a summary of those, and against my argument was there were 3 papers. And so I actually think that if we're actually operating on obese patients unnecessarily by doing joint replacement, bearing in mind in Australia, 90% of knee replacements are done on patients who are overweight and obese. And
90%. So if people stop doing that, there goes their income, there goes their livelihood, there goes a big percentage of their practice.
Well, I did exaggerate that. Okay. The last year's figures, it was 89.9%. All right. So, but let's say 90%, and 74% of total hips are done on patients who are overweight and obese, and increasingly on young women. So, that's the demographics. That's from our joint registry, and we've got a problem. I mean, that's not an issue for my career, but the next generation of orthopedic surgeons are going to be operating on these people when their joints fail.
Yeah.
And they're going to fail at a higher rate. We've already got that data. So they're going to fail at a higher rate on younger people, and they're going to be, it's just another layer of the tsunami of lifestyle-related disease that's going to be upon the next generation of the medical profession.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how the demographics are changing unless we can impact it and reverse it, which is a big part of your message, isn't it?
And I'm just saying, if your tire's worn out on your car, you're still going to need to have it replaced. But if you drive it around carefully and you take a few rocks out of it, it'll last longer.
Yeah.
And then when you actually have your surgery, it's going to be easier on the patient, easier on the surgeon, easier on the system. They're going to be in hospital less time.
Right. And that's an interesting point. So a lot of people may not think about that. There's the question of, do you need the surgery or do you not? But also, how much time is it going to take? How much is the rehab going to take? What kind of impact is that going to have on your life? Those are important questions as well that a lot of people probably don't think as much about.
Little simple things. I'll go back to smoking. That patients who are smokers spend longer time in the recovery ward. The same thing actually goes with obese patients.
Yeah.
They've got longer times for the anaesthetic, longer recovery times, much heavier nursing problems in the hospitals, staffing problems. You've got to have extra staff on board to move them around.
Right.
Then you've got higher workers' compensation rates because of people getting back injuries.
It's a snowball effect, isn't it?
There's another interesting thing which is coming around. It is in pain management. And not just in acute pain, but in chronic pain management, there's that whole role of a ketogenic diet in that. So it's, again, anecdotal.
Right.
But I've got patients who are actually running low-carb and keto, and they seem to have less post-operative pain in their surgery.
Why do you think that is? You think it's something about the ketones, something about the sugar and the carbs, or a combination of both?
I think both. I think that sugar, I mean, I use the example of, give kids sugar at a party and they go hyper, and then a few hours later they're
crash,
flat and depressed. On the side note, what would happen to society if we gave everyone on the planet sugar at the one time? We'd have anxiety, depression, anger, mental health issues, and whatever. Guess what? We've got all of those.
All of those, yeah.
But if we look at it also from the ketogenic aspect of in neurodegenerative disorders, that nerves can run just as happily on a glucose load as they can on a ketone load. So again, it seems to have a beneficial effect in the neurodegenerative disorders. And there are a few papers out there now in pain management talking about ketogenic diets. So again, I just use those to my patients. I can't force this upon you, but here's a non-drug alternative.
Right. Yeah.
And these are all about giving your patients tools to manage their own condition.
Right. So you mentioned a non-drug alternative, and that brings up another whole big topic that you've been very vocal about. So when you're promoting a non-drug alternative in a culture that's sort of fueled by drug companies and drug money, you are going against some very big forces that probably don't want you to succeed. And you have turned, not only as a physician, but you've turned into an investigative reporter, you along with your wife, Belinda, to uncover a lot of sort of the beginnings of an anti-meat campaign, of people with vested interest in not promoting LCHF. And it's sort of fascinating and almost unbelievable what you found. So I know it's a big topic, but kind of summarize some of the basics of what you found that shocked you, and have certainly shocked a lot of people who you've been talking to about it.
I think the first thing is that the science behind LCHF is actually sound. It's biochemistry. It's the stuff that we learn in the first 50 pages of textbooks. It's not in the fine print. So the science, I often describe that eating real food, LCHF, is if you eat food that's fresh, local, seasonal, then by definition it is low in carbohydrate. It's low in it doesn't have added sugars.
Right.
It doesn't have lots of carbohydrate in it. It has healthy fats in it and it has protein in it. So the definition of real food is LCHF, whereas the definition of the standard standard diet for everyone is it comes out of a paper bag or a plastic bag.
Right.
And that's unhealthy. So all I've been arguing and all discussing, and yourself and others and in the scientific world, is like we're just talking biochemistry, and real food can't by definition be unhealthy. And Belinda made this observation, myself and Tim Noakes in particular, are under investigation for recommending real food. She said, you guys are going blue in the face until there's got to be something else. So it wasn't until she started to investigate my case, because I was clearly under investigation for a few years. She said she came across that the expert witness that somehow mysteriously appeared into my case was actually someone very high up in the nutrition world who was working for a cereal company at the time. So how come the breakfast cereal industry got involved in my case?
Yeah.
And it took another 3 years, but towards the end of 2018, we came across, Belinda came across 600 pages of internal emails from the Australian breakfast cereal industry. And in it had the concepts of paleo and low carb were affecting cereal sales. Profits were down, and these 7 people were to be targeted. Now, I ended up being the only Australian doctor on that list that was meant for targeting.
Wow.
And they actually then had, in the documents, it had detailed as to which media people they were going to be working with in the newspapers, the magazines, across all forums to actually target those people who are promoting low carb and paleo. So, I mean, that's scary stuff. And
that is scary.
And this is actually not some low document. This was actually the briefing document to the CEOs of the heads of the cereal industry in Australia. So Kellogg's, Nestle, Sanitarium, Freedom Foods, and the head of the Food and Grocery Council. Now, I'm happy to say that because I've actually presented those individual names to a Senate inquiry calling them out. So those, everyone says, oh, that's Australia, but those 5 CEOs, or 4 of those, report directly to the CEOs here in the US. So this is the cereal industry, the biggest corporates at the bottom of that food pyramid, they promote the cereals and grains, are actually in a working relationship with the Dietitians Association. They were being paid to actually promote the benefits of sugar and cereal. And the Dietitians Association in Australia, just like here in the US, are the ones that effectively write the dietary guidelines. So here we've got the cereal industry directly paying the Dietitians Association not only to be involved in targeting of those voices against it, talking preventative health, but they're also the ones writing the dietary guidelines. So if you think that started opening Pandora's box. Now, realise that took some years to work out.
Right.
But along the way, Belinda's investigation has completely uncovered, and we're effectively unravelling what's happened with my education, your education, and the future of health education for along nutrition lines. So the long and the short of it is we've gone back in history. And if you look at the history of the dietary guidelines, they've changed over time. They used to be meat and dairy based. And over the last 100 years, the dietary guidelines in Western society have become cereal based, anti-meat, anti-dairy, and rapidly approaching vegetarian and vegan.
Right. So the way people ate, I mean, sort of before there were guidelines, the way people ate was very heavy based in meat and low in grains.
Even the early 20th century ones was meat and dairy based.
Right.
But as it's evolved in 1972, saw the McGovern report, and in 1992 was actually the full-on food pyramid. And now we're sort of seeing the My Plate here in the US. But effectively, it's, again, I'll come back, cereal-based, anti-meat, anti-dairy, approaching vegan, vegetarian.
Right.
And when you look at the history of that, that's where we've spent a lot of time. So from the dietetics, that nutrition aspect, the dietary guidelines were started effectively by the Dietitians Association of America, or the American Dietetics Association in 1917. The founder of that association was a woman by the name of Lena Cooper. Lena Cooper was a protege of John Harvey Kellogg. So she was working for John Harvey Kellogg. She effectively started the American Dietetics Association. She then wrote the textbooks for the next 30 years for dietetics, which formed the basis of dietetics and nutrition for the world. For the model, first of all, the model of the Dietetics Association, as well as the textbooks, became that for not only the US, but for Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand. So the Western organisations all followed suit, and effectively the cereal industry was right there at the beginning.
Yeah, we like to think that this was altruistic and just trying to benefit society and tell them the best way to be healthy. But once you have industry involved, you can't assume it's altruistic anymore. And why should an industry be involved? There's no reason industry should, with a bias and with a vested interest, should be involved in telling people what to eat. But somehow the two got combined very early and have never really separated.
Well, they haven't separated at all.
Yeah.
And of greater concern is that the basis of cereal isn't grounded in science. It's actually grounded in ideology.
Right. So that's the other risky part. Not only is it industry, but now we're bringing in religion and ideology. Another thing that has no place in telling us how to be healthy, really.
Well, John Harvey Kellogg and Lena Cooper were both vegetarians, both members of the Adventist Church, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church have been right there at the beginning, heavily promoting their concept, and they are promoting the Garden of Eden diet, which is vegan, cereal-based, anti-meat, anti-dairy, vegan. Now, that's it. And effectively, they have been there influencing the dietary guidelines for 100 years. So the people involved in writing the vegetarian mandate for the American Association and for the Australian dietetics guidelines were effectively all vegan, vegetarian. In the American one, 8 out of the 9 were actually Seventh-day Adventists.
8 out of 9.
8 out of 9 were vegetarian, vegan.
Okay.
5 of the 9 were Adventists, and the other person who was neither vegan nor vegetarian nor Adventist was working for the processed food industry.
Wow. So
here we've got major influence at the highest levels, which has actually come from religious ideology. And the ideology, look, they're well-intentioned, and I've got no problem. I mean, this is not anti-religion. It's just, if you've got a belief, then I'm very happy for you to have that belief. However, make it grounded. But if you want to start promoting that and influencing that for all population, make certain it's grounded on science and not an ideology for salvation.
But that's what's so interesting is that the narrative has changed, right? Because they can't say it's because of religion and because it's for salvation. So because a lot of people aren't going to be open to that message. So the message has sort of changed. Now it's or it was health, then it was environment, and then it's ethics. So the narrative keeps changing, but I guess one of the points that you're saying, it still all comes from that ideological backbone. Is that right?
They are not so much pro-cereal as they are anti-meat.
Anti-meat, right?
That's the basis of Ellen G. White's prophecies, and her belief is that meat is one of the if you consume meat, then that is as close to demonizing yourself as you can possibly do, and that you will not get salvation if you do that. And that's a background. It's I shouldn't use the word backbone of their belief system. So the terms meat causes violence, meat causes masturbation, meat causes cancer. Those terms are coming around in the the late 19th century, the 1860s, 1870s. The meat causes heart disease came up in the 1900s. Essentially, we worked out that meat doesn't cause masturbation, and meat doesn't really cause violence. So those messages are late 19th century ones. So then we got the next message is, meat causes cancer, which has continued to come along. And if you look at the data, that's very poor association data for a couple of rare, a couple of cancers with low relative risk ratios,
Right.
but nonetheless get over-marketed. And so that narrative of fat causes heart disease is actually part of the meat causes heart disease. It's whatever they can use to try and travel that path. So we've now moved on back to meat causes cancer, and now the latest cause is meat causes environmental harm.
Mm-hmm.
It's all complete and utter nonsense. But you've got to realise the backing of this is coming from a religious ideology for salvation, not for health.
Yeah, but since we don't hear much, I mean, aside from when you and Belinda started talking about it, nobody was bringing this up about religious salvation. So I think a lot of people probably say, that's not true anymore. I mean, now it's more just maybe industry and people promoting the environment. But it sounds like you would argue no, the ideological process is still there strongly.
I'll argue both.
Yeah.
First of all, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has been on this bandwagon for a long time. People go, they're only a small group, but they are the second biggest educator in the world after the Catholic Church. They're massive. The number of schools, just off the top of my head, it's 1,400 schools, a couple of hundred, it's 100 universities around the world.
Wow.
They've got an enormous amount of funding. Just in the US, they've got 28 hospitals in Florida alone.
They run 28 hospitals in Florida alone.
Yes.
Wow. That's
and so they have this ongoing message coming through.
Yeah.
The other big issue is that they spend a lot of time in the developing world on missionary work and promoting their message, their health message, and they use that as the entering wedge of the church. So they're not coming along saying, we're going to give you salvation, we're going to give you health.
Right.
Come away around to our way of eating, which is their big promotional one. There's a thing called the CHIP program, and it's being introduced in countries like Fiji is just adopting it as an entire country. I mean, the Polynesians, the last thing they need is more cereals and grains with their obesity and diabetes epidemic. But it's also being introduced in the US via insurance companies. CHIP program is being adopted, and it's effectively a vegan program with a background of religious ideology to use as an entering wedge into the church. And so it's right there front and central. And the important thing is they're not hiding any of this. If you actually, look at their stuff, and last year in 2018, they published a 20-page article in a journal called Religion, acknowledging everything I've just said.
Really?
They're very proud of it. They've got a health agenda for the world. The other, that's the religious ideology. They're promoting that because they need to get the message to every corner of the world, every tongue. I think is actual
every tongue,
and then for Christ's return. Now, I'm okay for you to have your belief, but it shouldn't be forced upon the world's population, both in our eating habits and therefore our agricultural practices.
Right.
The other thing that's involved, that the SDA are involved in, is that they effectively own the cereal industry of the world and the soy industry and the alternative meat industry. They were right there at the beginning. The first meat alternatives, the nut analogues, were in fact invented by John Harvey Kellogg.
Oh, were they really?
Yeah. The soy was effectively brought from China by a fellow Harry China Miller. So he was an Adventist missionary, and he started a whole lot of soy plants in conjunction with Adventist outposts in China. But effectively, he brought soy back to the US, and the soy infant formula was promoted primarily by him. And now we see soy and infant formula, every day on every supermarket shelf. You've got to realise that they were there at the beginning, and so they're still there, and they've got not only got their own push at an ideological level, they've also got their own food industries.
And now they're getting funding and venture capital in Silicon Valley involved in backing these fake meat products, and that's sort of a little more dangerous, because now once the money gets involved, it can start to snowball. And I saw a Twitter post you made about, can you identify which is the fake meat burger and which is dog food? And they looked very similar, didn't they?
Well, you couldn't pick them.
Yeah.
The Silicon Valley have come in on the tail end of it, I suppose. It's probably not the tail end. It's another. I'll keep using the term entering wedge. One of the big issues we see is that the medical education. So the current education model is being heavily pushed that we need to travel down the pathway of lifestyle medicine. Sounds great.
Sounds great.
Sounds great. Let's exercise more and eat well and get plenty of sleep and sunshine and have good communication skills. But the nutrition side of that is to move towards vegan.
Yeah.
And that is, in fact, most people don't realize, but lifestyle medicine is the Adventist Church. So in all of its different names, and it started as the Christian Association of Lifestyle Medicine, and that's ultimately just moved through a series of name changes, but it's widespread right around the world. And that has a good message. However, it's about medical education and pushing that pathway. Side by side with that is the term exercise as medicine, which is actually trademarked. And one of the initial founding members of that trademark and exercise as medicine is Coca-Cola. So in this strange relationship, we've got these two arms coming together in medical education. Look up LifeMed, which is education. The whole concept of education now being controlled by lifestyle medicine, pushing a vegan, plant-based agenda, and Coca-Cola coming in, and they effectively dropped they started becoming involved with lifestyle medicine in 2010, started coming into significant relationships 2012, and then the funding pedal was pressed 2014, 2015. So we're now seeing this whole rise of the vegan agenda, and they don't realise that the propaganda has actually been fed by the lifestyle medicine Adventist Church message, Garden of Eden diet, with the backbone of the processed food industry, led by Coca-Cola.
Great marketing.
And they've come together, but the trouble is here in the US, you've got now 8 universities are adopting this lifestyle medicine plant-based diet as their medical education.
And they don't understand, I'm sure, the religious part of it. They don't open their eyes to the industry part of it. They think this is a healthier way for individuals. I want to give people the benefit of the doubt and say they legitimately want to help patients get better and help people lead healthier lives. But we sort of have to pull back the curtain and show them what the science says and where this is coming from. And they have to question, why is Coca-Cola involved? I mean, these things need to be more front and center.
The processed food industry is well positioned to continue the vegan agenda.
Well, they will profit greatly from it, won't they?
In fact, that is their... and in fact, we've come across some documents, again, from the Adventist Church and their food arm, saying that they're expecting a 25% increase in their profit next year because of the adoption of their vegan Garden of Eden diet by millennials. And so, again, it's all about being open in a discussion. I'm very happy for you to present to me. I'd like to present, here's my educational package to teach to my medical students, but I come from a religious ideological background promoting this for salvation. and I've got the backing of the processed food industry, which is going to help their profit line.
Right.
I mean, you wouldn't buy into that, would you?
No.
Yet we've got an entire generation out there who are taking up this agenda because it's based on animal welfare, animal rights, and questionable environmental statistics. And Peter Ballistat's work is just phenomenal. And I've said to Peter, look, I say to when I'm talking about this, I don't trust Peter either. I think he's got a cold counter argument. And there's another side to the coin when you look at the whole environmental impact.
Yeah.
Let's look at both sides of it rather than just taking for granted what you hear on Cowspiracy or Forks Over Knives, because that's clearly an agenda-driven one.
Yeah.
And you've got to realise that, again, that agenda is coming from the Garden of Eden diet, Adventists,
right,
and the food industry, Coca-Cola, Ilse. We're not conspiratorial. Now, we looked at this for a couple of years before we sought counsel from other people, saying, oh, have we lost the plot on this? And all we're doing is having it ratified. And then last year, as I said, the Seventh-day Adventist Church came out very proudly saying, yeah, we're behind this, because they have an agenda. They believe in it.
Yeah. And it sort of leads me to think about the Eat Lancet campaign, right? Because it seems like that was the attempt to now say this is science-based and evidence-based. And that's what Eat Lancet was supposed to be, an evidence-based report to tell us all why we should adopt a vegan lifestyle. But when you dissect it, you can see the evidence isn't there. Their recommendations are not based on high-level quality of evidence. So if anything, I would hope that would hurt their mission more once people realize that it was basically a well-funded media campaign that wasn't based in science. But yet, I don't think that message is getting out there. But the message that's being propagated more is, look at this evidence-based approach now to being vegan. And that seems pretty problematic when you start to distort what the evidence says.
Oh, look, scientific evidence is thrown out the window, I think, nowadays.
Yeah.
It's completely and utterly biased. Eat Lancet had significant funding behind it from the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry, massive funding.
Yeah, why would pharmaceutical industry be involved there? That makes no sense, except they're going to profit from it, but they should have no seat at the table there.
None whatsoever. And it's disappointing to see that Lancet actually published it in the first place, because it didn't require a lot of review of the articles to realise they were they were just poor articles.
Yeah.
They're very biased. I think it's almost worth taking another step backwards. The Adventist health studies, which have quoted over and over of the benefits of vegan vegetarian, were flawed. And so when you actually look into them, and they're quoted over and over and over, but they're actually the Adventist studies, or studies done by people affiliated with the Adventist Church, that requote their own articles. So those 3 Adventist studies, last time I looked at them, had been requoted each time by themselves over 400 times. That meant there were over 1,200 recitations by themselves.
By themselves.
Yeah, so, let's say I write an article, and then I'll cite myself on that article.
Right.
And then I cite myself on that article twice. All of a sudden, they've compounded. But if you keep telling everyone that your Adventist health studies are fabulous, but the first 2 Adventist health studies, the definition of vegetarian was that as long as you didn't have meat more than once a week.
Yeah.
And the definition of vegan was that as long as you didn't have meat more than once a month.
So when people say they were perfectly healthy on a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet, you don't realize that still involves some meat by those definitions.
And when you actually dissect those studies and have a good look at them, there are other studies showing that other populations, not just Adventists, actually outlive them.
Yeah.
So, and they, right through to quoting the blue zones in Okinawa. I've actually gotten back to those Okinawan articles, and they're actually eating pork.
They're eating pork. And Sardinia has the Sardinia pig, and they're goat farmers, and I mean, there's a lot there that didn't come up in the blue zone.
There's a lot of meat that's actually out there,
Yeah.
and I'm all for having community and spirituality, and togetherness, and sunlight, and exercise, and rest.
Right.
And living by the seasons and sleeping by the sun. But don't tell me it's because you've got a plant-based diet when the other variables are just so important. And particularly when that plant-based diet's been supplemented with meat.
Right.
Yeah.
Does it seem like just too daunting, though, too overwhelming, that there's too much behind this mission now, too much behind the push, that it's like we're fighting a losing battle? Or do you think there's something we can do to show people, to open their eyes to where this is coming from and help them see the other side of the equation?
Well, that's why we're having a chat today.
Right.
Because if we both thought it was hopeless, we would have stopped. I have children. We've got a grandson. You know, this is my future's already determined, but his isn't. And some of the people listening or watching might have seen that Pixar movie WALL-E.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's brilliant. I often refer people, so go and watch WALL-E.
Yeah.
Very, very completely on the mark, in that we're, as a society right now, we're fat, we're overhanging our chairs, we're lethargic, we're sick, we're medicated to the hilt. And I know it sounds harsh, and I honestly think this is completely and utterly unsustainable. And we're about to come over a precipice. You know, it's not going to be a social decline, it's going to be a social cliff. We're going to go over. It's going to be really ugly in the next 10 years. But in that movie, The Green Leaf, well, that's my grandson. You know, I'm hoping that he's going to be armed with health. He'll understand you need to eat real food.
So explain that for people who haven't seen the movie. What do you mean by
well,
that?
in the movie, no, go and watch it, everyone.
Yeah.
But in the movie, effectively, mankind's been wiped off the planet. We've destroyed our own planet underneath us, and there's a group of survivors which are still floating around in a spaceship, trying to find a spot to actually live. But they actually realise if you actually go back to Earth and you do it right, then there's a future again on Earth. And so therefore, every economic marker, every health marker I look at is that we're going to have a massive change in population health. And it's scary. However, I mean, I'm not depressed. I've suffered from this thing called hyperpragmatism. You know,
Hyperpragmatism.
So I'm just being pragmatic about it. This is happening before us. You can see it when you walk down the street. You see it in your family, your community. You see it in the hospitals. We need to do something about it. But it's going to be messy. But let's prepare the next generation for making the difference.
Right.
And that's what, you know, that's the education I want to see. And my problem, or Belinda and our problem at the moment, is we see that the education model that's being introduced in the US, being pushed in Australia, you know, going back some years, I think it was being pushed into my own university. And as it turns out, my medical students were going to be having this new curriculum thrust upon them. And that's when I came out and started talking to them about, actually, that's all nonsense. You know, I'm talking about real food, LCHF, blah, blah, blah. I didn't realise I'd actually trodden on a hornet's nest in my own hospital to my own students, but they were the group that were having this new experimental teaching upon them.
Right.
That's all gone by the wayside, but I think that's part of why I got into trouble, because
you weren't just affecting patients, you were influencing the next generation of physicians, and industry is going to see that as a big problem that they need to squash.
But where we are now is this. So have we quashed Eat Lancet? Has it been questioned? Yes, but that's only their first phase. It's not even their first phase. It's going to keep coming. But it's up to everyone to start calling out, saying, let's call out the science. Let's see who's behind it, who's pushing it.
Right. Because
we've seen the results of the last major dietary change intervention in public health policy, and that was the introduction of the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. We've had that social experiment for the last 40 years, 50 years. The next thing which is being pushed literally down our throats is the plant-based, vegan diet, anti-meat, pro-cereal,
right?
As Belinda says, with a side of Coke.
Brought to you by Coke with a smile.
Yeah, and if it's not our fault that if you're fat and sick, it's because it's your lifestyle and you haven't exercised enough. You know, we've got that whole concept ingrained in our psyche. You're fat, therefore you're lazy. Well, it's not. It's actually what we've been eating, but we've convinced everyone that it's because they're lazy.
Yeah, so we need to get rid of that industry influence, and get rid of the religion influence, and get rid of the pharmaceutical industry influence when it comes to educating people, educating our future doctors, educating the public. But how do we do that? I mean, that's a much harder question. How do we do that? Because it's a free market society, and they've got their fingers so deep in people's pockets that they don't know how to get out of it.
And if you stand up against them, you get into trouble.
Yeah.
because I refused to follow the guidelines. My patients in hospital with diabetes, out of control, we were being given 3 serves of ice cream per day. And I said, this is ridiculous. And then I was told, they're the guidelines.
Yeah.
That's sort of the beginning of my journey against the system. I said, well,
Right.
the guidelines are wrong then. And they said, no, they're the guidelines. We can't change them. We have to do as we're told. And I said, okay, I'm going to try and change the guidelines. So what do? Well, we stand up. You start questioning.
Yeah.
One of the problems in medicine is we're educated on this read, repeat, reward concept. It does not suit us as trainees and as doctors to read something and then question it, because
Right.
then you get into trouble, and then you're reported to the medical board because you're saying, I can't recommend ice cream to my patients because. And that's literally what happened. I got reported because I said, this is ridiculous. Stop serving my patients ice cream.
And that's such an important point, just the read, repeat, reward, because how are other industries educated? How are engineers taught? They're taught to question everything, to analyze things from different sides, to try and find why one solution is wrong, and in medicine, we're not taught that, are we? We're not taught to be critical thinkers like that.
Well, but we used to be until 1910.
Yeah. What happened in 1910?
1910 was the introduction of the Flexner Report. So before 1910, we had a much more holistic approach to medicine. And in 1910, Rockefeller of oil and Carnegie of steel commissioned Abraham Flexner to do the Flexner Report, which was to actually look at medical education.
Yeah.
And it became a two-way fight almost at that time between William Osler, who is one of the fathers of medicine, who believed that we should be not medicating our patients. We should be bedside teachers and bedside carers. And he was very much against the experimental and drug model. But Flexner came in with this agenda to actually change medical education. It's a fascinating story. And ultimately, the Flexner Report won through, big money won out, and the model of medical education became one of that, let's laboratory test and medicate. We stopped the bedside caring, we stopped the holistic interactions. We didn't stop them completely.
But certainly minimized
We
them.
minimised it. And out of that model, because then Rockefeller came along and supported those institutions that actually adopted the model, 50 medical schools around the US and Canada were closed in the subsequent years. And those ones that remained had effectively adopted that model. And that was to medicate and to test. And along with that, which was a burgeoning time for the pharmaceutical industry, the development of multiple drugs was the birth of the modern pharmaceutical industry. And so therefore, all around 1910 to 1917, we had the birth of the pharmaceutical industry. We had the birth of nutrition science, which is not science at all. It's about palatability, marketability, shelf life, profit. But we had the two that came together. And so I call that generational education. So since 1910, 1917, we've had the pharmaceutical industry educating us on how to treat our patients. We've had the food industry telling us, or educating us, I'll use a softer term, on what to eat. And we've lost the ability to think, because they then develop the guidelines. The guidelines say stick within these parameters, but the guidelines at the best only are useful for the median group. But say one standard deviation, 2/3 of the population. That leaves 1/3 of the population out to the side, which the guidelines don't fit. But you as a medico have to prescribe according to the guidelines for the median group. That means potentially we're doing harm to at least 1/3 of the population.
Well, and you could even reverse that and say if the guidelines were designed for healthy people, and then now our society is 2/3 unhealthy. So you can sort of flip that on your head in terms of who that represents. But I think that's such an important take-home lesson. Whether people can take home from this discussion that, we should not be vegan and we should eat meat, or, whether it's healthy or environmentally sound, the most important lesson is question what you're told, question the norm, question the guidelines, because the people who've put those out haven't questioned the influences. We need to do that. And whether you agree or not, you have to at least ask the questions. And if you then ask the questions and still agree with them, that's fine. You've done your own due diligence. But we can't just accept things on face value. We can't do that anymore because the role of industry, the role of money, the role of religion is too deeply rooted. That's what you and Belinda have taught me, that those roots go so deep that we just have to start asking the questions and never stop asking the questions. I think that's the most important lesson.
Well, the generational education is you don't question your teachers, nor did if they didn't question their teachers before them. That's where we're at now. We've just been scared and afraid to question our teachers. And you're absolutely right. Question. So if your doctor asks you, says, I want you to take this medication, don't be afraid to say why.
Right.
And and when you adopt an LCHF, low carb, healthy fat lifestyle, the very first question I get from doctors all the time is, I'm worried about the patient's cholesterol. And the patients get that. They're intimidated by that. And I have one really, really simple reply for the health professionals, the doctors in question. I say, what is cholesterol? And the scary thing is 99% of doctors cannot answer the question. I just say, what's cholesterol? And unless your doctor can come up with at least 5 things which cholesterol is there for, then don't take his advice or her advice. I mean, or just question it, because unless we're questioning the doctors, then the doctors aren't going to go away and learn because they're just following the guidelines.
Right.
And I dared to question. And when you start looking at nutrition science, or what I call non-science or nonsense, it's a house of cards.
Yeah.
And that's all my journey's been in the last 10 years. I press the pack of cards and it just keeps falling down. Doesn't matter if it's cholesterol, if it's sugar, or if it's carbohydrate, it's fat or healthy fats and polyunsaturated oils, or unfortunately everything I've pressed is falling down. And so my textbooks I've come to question. Harrison's, I presume Harrison's principles of medicine. I can remember my father giving it to me on my 18th birthday. Actually, it was 18 plus 1 day because he said I couldn't give it to on my birthday because I was completely drunk. And he gave it to me. He gave it to me the following morning. I can still remember out in the back porch. He said, "Here's the book. Your birthday card's under the definition of alcohol, next to alcohol." I can still remember it. Very funny.
That's hilarious.
But I mean, that's our go-to book. And the editors of Harrison's last year were paid over $11 million US, undeclared, by the pharmaceutical industry.
Oh, that's so depressing to hear.
So, well, okay, I don't mind you being paid, but put it across the front cover of Harrison's. This has been influenced by the pharmaceutical industry to the tune of $11 million. Just put it across there. And then I know what hat you're wearing.
Right. Well, I mean, on the one hand, it's so depressing to hear that the influence runs so deep, but on the other hand, it's great to have voices like yours and Belinda's opening our eyes to that influence and giving us the permission to question, because that's what we need. So I want to thank you for all the information you're putting out there. And although I'm sorry for the struggles you had to go through, I'm glad it was you, because you were the right person to come through that and become the spokesman to teach us to open our eyes and ask these questions. So it's remarkable what you're doing to try and help educate people in the right way and help them educate themselves. So if people want to hear more about you and read more about what you've written and what you've done, where can we direct them to go?
Look, I think the best site at this point in time is one that Belinda set up called isupportgary.com. I know it sounds corny, but that's why she set it up. She set it there because I was under investigation and being hammered by the system.
Yeah.
And therefore, her research and a lot of this stuff is on isupportgary.com. I'm on Twitter. Belinda's on Twitter. We're still on Facebook. That says Belinda Fetke, no fructose. That was changed from Gary Fetke, no fructose, in the midst of all the medical board investigations. And that was, they said, look, you can't talk about this. So we literally just drew a line through Gary and wrote Belinda.
Yeah.
And because they can't silence her. And I've now been cleared to start talking about this stuff again. I don't think anybody wants me talking about it apart from the patients and the community.
Only the people who want to get better.
That's right.
Yeah.
But we're still out there.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Gary. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Brett.